year was 1973. Richard Nixon was president of the United States, and U.S. troops had been fighting in Vietnam for nearly 18 years, all without an official declaration of war. This prompted Congress to pass the War Powers Resolution of 1973, preventing any future president from involving the U.S. in an undeclared war. Congress had traditionally declared war or authorized the president to use military force against enemies beyond its borders, a power granted exclusively to them by Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution. The War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, these were all declared by Congress. But after World War II, things got a bit fuzzy. Some presidents started taking military liberties with their role as commander-in-chief of the armed forces, a power also granted by the Constitution. In 1950, President Harry Truman sent U.S. troops to help defend South Korea against North Korean invaders. He called it a police action, so technically it wasn't a war. In 1963, President John F. Kennedy sent supplies and military advisors to South Vietnam. Less than a year later, U.S. troops were fighting in the Vietnam War, including in the Gulf of Tonkin, all without that official declaration. And then in 1969, President Richard Nixon began bombing Cambodia in secret, hiding missions from both Congress and the American people. It took more than a year for this information to leak to the public, and it wasn't until 1973 that Congress ordered an immediate end to the bombing raids. But at this point, Congress realized more needed to be done to check the power of the president when it came to war. So, on November 7, 1973, Congress passed the War Powers Resolution. The idea was to ensure that Congress and the president agreed on war actions before committing troops into hostile situations. There are a few key parts to the War Powers Resolution. First, the president must consult and report to Congress before sending troops overseas, though he or she can initiate sending troops in the case of an attack. Second, if the president initiates a hostile action, it can only last for 60 days plus a 30-day withdrawal period. Then, Congress has to vote on whether it can continue, unless Congress can't meet because of an attack on the U.S. mainland. And finally, if forces have been deployed that aren't acting on a declaration of war, the president must remove them at direction of Congress. Although the War Powers Resolution had broad bipartisan support, it didn't pass without a fight. After they voted to pass the bill, President Nixon vetoed it. Nixon argued that it violated the constitutional powers of the president, and that the only way to limit the president's role as commander-in-chief would be to amend the Constitution itself. But Congress voted again and overrode the veto. The War Powers Resolution became law. Despite the resolution, presidents and Congress have still been at odds when it comes to military action. In 1981, President Ronald Reagan deployed several U.S. military advisors to El Salvador without reporting to Congress. Some members of Congress filed a federal lawsuit, but the court dismissed the case. In the 90s, President Bill Clinton sent forces to Kosovo, and troops remained there for more than the 60-day limit. This resulted in another lawsuit from members of Congress, but once more, the federal court refused to intervene. So while the War Powers Resolution has limited the president's ability to send troops overseas, the branches of government still wrestle over their powers, which is exactly what the nation's founders intended.
Math shows an attack that was deliberate and sustained. With around a half dozen explosions, the Americans firing with drones clearly didn't want to miss their target. Iran's general Qasem Soleimani. He'd reportedly just gotten into Iraq from Beirut and was leaving Baghdad airport when he was killed in a convoy of vehicles along with a top Iraqi militia leader. President Trump tonight.
Soleimani was plotting imminent and sinister attacks on American diplomats and military personnel, but we caught him in the act and terminated him.
The imminent attacks planned by Soleimani targeted U.S. diplomats, U.S. military personnel, and facilities that house Americans in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and the region of the Middle East, a senior State Department official told reporters today. Qasem Soleimani was no ordinary general. The U.S. officially classified him as a terrorist, but in Iran, he was a national hero. Specifically, Soleimani was in charge of spreading Iranian influence around the world, and he was extremely good at it. Smart, charismatic, ruthless, strategic, and bold, Soleimani knit together a loyal network of armed groups from Iraq to Syria, Lebanon to Afghanistan. Anytime Iran attacked oil tankers in the Persian Gulf and then denied it, or attacked oil facilities in Saudi Arabia and denied that too, U.S. officials saw Soleimani's handiwork. His power made Iranians proud. Today, Iranians in the thousands came out to show their love and their anger. Soleimani was arguably Iran's most popular leader. For years, Soleimani operated in the shadows, and he spilled a lot of American blood. He was the secret architect of a long campaign against U.S. troops in Iraq after the 2003 invasion, killing hundreds. Back then, his face was barely known. But over the last few years, Soleimani has gotten bolder, showing photographs of himself on battlefields around the Middle East, issuing statements. His pride and increasing profile may have made him easier to track down and kill. There was talk in Iran Soleimani might be a future president, or perhaps even a supreme leader. Today, the man who has that role, Iran's top Ayatollah, visited Soleimani's family and promised severe revenge. The most immediate concern is in Baghdad, where Shiite militia leaders loyal to Soleimani, the same militias that for days attacked the U.S. embassy, will take to the streets tomorrow to mourn and show their rage.
And Richard joins us now from Iraq, where our team is hearing late word of another airstrike. Richard, what do we know?
An Iraqi security official told us that another convoy has been targeted by an American airstrike. This convoy carrying leaders from the Iraqi Shia militias, those same militias who are going to protest tomorrow, angry protests in Baghdad, not far from the U.S. Embassy. So this could escalate. It could lead to a cycle of violence. It just got more dangerous tonight.
Richard Engel with that.
But the American people should know that President Trump's decision to remove Qasem Soleimani from the battlefield saved American lives. There's no doubt about that. He was actively plotting in the region to take actions, a big action as he described it, that would have put dozens, if not hundreds, of American lives at risk.
For too long, this evil man operated without constraint, and countless innocents have suffered for it. Now his terrorist leadership has been ended. Now, predictably enough, in this political environment, the operation that led to Soleimani's death may prove controversial or divisive.
It is my view that the president does not have the authority for a war with Iran. If he plans a large increase in troops and potential hostility over a longer time, the administration will require congressional approval and the approval of the American people. The president's decision may add to an already dangerous and difficult situation in the Middle East. The risk of a much longer military engagement in the Middle East is acute and immediate.
How significant is this? We killed the most powerful man in Iran, short of the Ayatollah. He was the right fist of the Ayatollah, and we took the Ayatollah's arm off.
This is a president who has been a horrible commander-in-chief when it comes to making us a more of a safe nation. Yeah. And now, potentially, we're going to see what the fallout of this is and see if indeed it's part of a larger strategy, which unfortunately with his record, I doubt it is.
I've said for a long time that going to war with Iran would make the war in Iraq and even Afghanistan look like a picnic. It will be far more costly and devastating in American lives and in taxpayer dollars. And I don't believe the American people want to go to war.
As we all remember, Trump promised to end endless wars. Tragically, his actions now put us on the path to another war, potentially one that could be even worse than before.
If we have learned nothing else from the Middle East in the last 20 years, it's that taking out a bad guy is not a good idea unless you are ready for what comes next.
I think it's really important for New Yorkers to understand that we are now potentially facing a threat that's different and greater than anything we have faced previously.
His sole job was to just export terrorism throughout the Middle East and do so in Iraq. To be caught right there in Baghdad is appropriate. But it also shows that this president, using our military, our intelligence, our State Department, doesn't draw red lines.
But in real time, making these decisions, you can't make a decision to take out a key general by committee. It just doesn't work that way. It never has worked that way, and candidly can't work that way in the future.
We're not going to lament his death. But the question is that has to be answered by the administration next week when Congress comes back into session is what brought us to this moment. We have had other moments in which we could have taken Soleimani out. We did not.